it's absolutely the norm. And I think, in talking about what either kind of matters or what doesn't matter at all, it makes clear what ultimately is going to drive the admissions committee wherever to decide whether to admit or not. And that's your academic performance, especially your academic performance in that particular field. And in the past, about 7 or 8 years ago, really just pre-COVID, the way that most universities overseas like to do this was through advanced placement tests or the IB diploma.
Mm-hmm. Kevin Newton is back. He's part of our frequently asked questions segment we're doing. We're taking a question today. Why don't you kick it off, Kevin? Let our listeners know what we're going to take on today.
So I think today we're just going to discuss from a very overarching view how admissions works when you step outside the United States, because in a lot of cases, I'd say the vast majority of cases, it's dramatically different.
Yeah, and why don't you talk about those differences? What are the most stark differences, the most consistent differences? And then later on we'll talk a little bit about how you're seeing things change a little bit. But let's focus right now on some of the ways in which it's different.
All right. Well, Mark, before we do that, I'm going to have to ask that you keep me honest in between the buoys here, because I'm very biased about this. And, I kind of want to preface this discussion in saying that if I seem to be very pro the rest of the world doing things, it's because this is what I live day in, day out. However, I have a lot of respect for the other way of doing things. And if you need any proof of that, and I think I've made reference to this on the podcast before, when my wife decided at age 30 she wanted to go to law school, I said, I know a number of great places in the UK you can practice, And she said, I need college football. And I will not survive without college football. So she actually chose her law school so she could have access to a second, or Power 4 now, conference to cheer for. So
so there's one of the differences right there is the role extracurriculars play or don't play in the evaluation.
Right.
You want to talk about that?
That's probably the biggest shock is, I'll get an email from a prospective parent, and they'll, I want them to include a little bit about their kid. I don't want it to be like have some dossier, someone's FBI file or something. But it is nice to, kind of know a little bit about the student. They'll list off, well, he's been playing tennis, or he's a pickleball champion, or he's really into chess. And I'm just thinking those are all great. They don't matter.
Yeah.
Unless we're looking at something like a sports management degree.
Sure.
Or I can't even make the connection with
that. Do you find when most students come to you, they don't know that? They think, oh, look at my extracurriculars, and they think that's their ticket in?
They really do. And it's something that, I kind of, for some students and for a lot of families, it's a huge relief. They can go to amazing universities.
Yeah.
And who cares that they were never a joiner or doing anything? The most powerful extracurricular you can do for the most competitive universities overseas is read. They really have this idea that, I think we've done this before. We're going to pick on UVA since we said nice things about them before. We're going to pick on UVA. It was about a year ago, I think it was The Atlantic or some other national publication of some esteem, interviewed a number of students, and one of their students, who was a recent admit to UVA, had said they'd never read a book from cover to cover. And the rest of the world has really grasped onto this as this is the American high school student that's never read a book that is going into university. So if you can say, well, I've read this outside of class, you immediately have them push aside all of their preconceived notions about what it is to come from an American high school. So Mark, I don't know about you, but I don't see a lot of my students, you would know this better than me, but when I'm asking, oh, well, how's your American stuff going? None of them are, talking about the books they've read as being a key part of the admissions puzzle. I don't know how true that is.
No, that's true. I mean, obviously you have St. John's and their Great Books program. That's based on that, right? You read 200 books there, and that's what you do. You read, you write, you debate. And the people that can't get enough of reading will look there. You apply to places like Columbia, Harvard. Some of these schools, Columbia's a long time. You have to write down all the books you've read as part of one of their questions. So there are schools that suss it out, and you can see it in their custom prompts that they value it and they target it. But yeah, I just did an interview on this podcast with William Deresiewicz, the founder of the book Excellent Sheep, New York Times bestseller, and he talked about that. And then I did another one with him on his book that deals with the end of solitude, a collection of essays. And he talked a lot about like what we're doing through social media, smartphones, killing the modern attention span, got to be overstimulated all the time, and how literally it's impacted reading. And he even talked about how it was impacting himself, and he had to stop and literally reprogram his brain. So that was a fascinating interview. But looking at, TikTok and social media and smartphones and how they're warring against the desire to read, it was fascinating. It made me think a lot. So you brought up a lot of good points. One thing you've brought up is extracurriculars.
Right.
Are not part of your credentials. Now, what about extracurriculars related to your intended major?
So those absolutely can be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And, we don't have to go swing for the fences with this. What they're really looking for is within what was accessible for you. How did you make it work? And if you're looking to study IR at someplace like St. Andrews or at King's College London, they also have a war studies program, which I always think it's funny. Who goes towards IR and who goes towards war studies? I digress on that. Just being involved in Model UN and just being able to talk about that being a positive experience is often great. So, it is the sort of thing that what we're looking to do here, the big underlying question we're trying to address in this, because this is all in a personal statement. We don't have an additional place to put all this, is when this gets tough, when this field of study gets tough, how do we know that you're still interested in it? That this isn't just the classic example is my engineering students. Engineers can have a pretty comfortable living, but engineering is a tough subject to study. And it's a little overblown when you're looking at that versus something like history, because me sitting here surrounded by my books, I cannot imagine why someone wouldn't like history.
Of course.
I just have
between history and Arabic.
Like,
I got you.
It's just I cannot imagine. But they're looking to see what's actually motivating you here, and we want to make.
Well, Kev, I don't think we've hit it as head on as we should hit it, which is like you're applying into a program or a field of study in a way that's much clearer over there than it is over here. Now, we have schools like that. I mean, the University of Texas at Austin, Kevin's in Dallas, they're all about that, right? Virginia Tech, Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. There are schools where you are applying into not just into a division of studies, but you're applying into a major.
Right.
With different admit rates by major in this country, but it's an outlier where there it's more the norm.
It's absolutely the norm. And I think, in talking about what either kind of matters or what doesn't matter at all, it makes clear what ultimately is going to drive the admissions committee wherever to decide whether to admit or not. And that's your academic performance, especially your academic performance in that particular field. And in the past, about 7 or 8 years ago, really just pre-COVID, the way that most universities overseas like to do this was through advanced placement tests or the IB diploma. There are still some places that rely heavily on these for different reasons. The IB diploma is great, but a lot of high schools don't take the actual qualifications for the diploma as seriously as their peer institutions in, say, the UK or Spain would. That's okay, because different countries, different approaches. But on one end of things, we have the Oxfords and the Cambridges and the Imperial Colleges of the world that really use the AP as that kind of gold standard. If you don't have the IB diploma and you're not taking A levels or anything like that, it's the closest we can get to an A level. And they want to see you go above and beyond. At the other end, and again, I'm going to try to be as delicate as possible with this, there are entire countries. The two that most obviously jump to mind are Italy and the Netherlands, that want you to have at least 3 threes. Some schools or some universities have a higher requirement because their secondary schools go into more depth than our secondary school systems do. And it's their way of quantifying that you're actually ready for university level study in this. Now, can you take AP exams without taking the test or without taking the courses? In theory, yes. I know last year I had a student in a very affluent part of the country who we went round and round trying to find some place for him to take an AP test. And it was just finding one AP test. This wasn't anything truly spectacularly difficult. Other places seem to hand AP exams out like candy. It's really, you get an AP test and you get an AP test and you get an AP test. So it is one of those questions of that the universities looking at this don't always know, and those that have kind of figured this out are starting to move towards things like dual enrollment, or your scores or your grades on honors or advanced courses combined with something like your ACT or SAT. But even then, the ACT or SAT is more of a check mark than anything graded. They're just making sure. I've got a student right now who was freaking out that he thought he needed above a 1500 for Cambridge to apply. And 1500 is the cutoff. We don't care if you get a 1510 or a 1560. In fact, I am not a testing expert, but I believe that's still pretty close to their standard deviation of, where your score should fall. So
it is.
We don't have to really dig in and, if you got a 1590, you got to try again. No, that doesn't exist. So,
but the SAT still counts there.
Yes.
In a more, I mean, I know what you're following here, but U.S. is coming back to testing for most of the most selective Ivy peers. Not all, but most of the Ivy peer level. Not necessarily the liberal arts colleges, and not true, certainly the University of California system as of now. But and lots and lots of schools are remaining test optional. But even those that are remaining test optional, they're mostly either test recommended or I want to see really good APs. I want some evidence of standardization for the most selective schools. The Dukes, the Vanderbilts, the Northwestern, schools like that. Like they may be test optional, but
right,
they want evidence. When you talk to their admissions people, they want standardized evidence. So increased emphasis on SAT, but especially AP even over SAT, right? Is that fair to say? Yep, AP over SAT. And of course, IB.
Right.
IB, higher level, standard level, all that.
For another AP, but the AP exams, if you're looking at the absolute most competitive. Now, again, once we move out of literally those Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, Imperial College, that's 4 of the 6 so-called Golden Triangle schools in the southeast of England. You notice I'm not saying UCL and King's, and that's because they are flirting with the idea that if you don't have access to APs, if your school doesn't teach them, they will consider alternative routes. I've yet to see how this actually plays out with my own students.
Right.
Their reps assure me that it's going to be fair, and I have no reason to doubt them. However, you want to see it with your own students first.
Sure, of course.
St. Andrews has always been pretty open about alternatives to test about the AP test because 20% of their student body's from the United States. So they kind of have to be. Edinburgh and Glasgow are loosening up, but we're seeing this return that maybe they went a little too far. Across the Irish Sea in Dublin, they still help. And I think
so. Kevin, would you say grades over testing? I mean, I'm sorry, testing over grades?
It depends. Which I know is a lousy answer.
No, but it's an accurate one. It's an accurate one.
I think if we're talking about those places that are in the top, the absolute most competitive universities, we want test scores. But if we're talking about still solid places that are global top 100, members of the Russell Group, et cetera, your grades can carry the day. What's fascinating, though, if we just shift it.
And is it both? Is it we want grades, but we need to see testing too? Or is it we want testing and we can be a little flexible with grades?
It depends. Which I know is another the 2 lousy answers in a row.
As long as you break it down, as long as you don't just leave me with it depends and then you full stop.
If
as long as you unpack it, I'm good.
If we're applying to something like medicine or engineering, they want those test scores. They want to know. If we're applying to something slightly less competitive, like in economics or law or something like that, they're going to want to see those high school grades backed up by a solid ACT or SAT. Just because they assume, okay, AP exams, those are their own thing, but they still assume you can get your hands on an ACT or SAT. And this tends to be the norm in the UK. Where things get interesting is where we look elsewhere. Australia and New Zealand, especially Australia, New Zealand is very grades driven to the point that I'm quite sure there are programs that don't actually look at your test scores other than just to confirm 1,000 on the SAT or something like that, which does tend to be a kind of bottom that we see is they want to make sure that you are ready for university study. There was the recent article, I forget where it was, that a UC San Diego study had shown, that a number of students were not ready for university study. I don't want to
Math.
misquote it,
Yeah.
but that's what they're looking to avoid.
Sure.
And whether or not standardized testing is the best way of doing that, that's a question beyond my pay grade.
Yeah.
But the perspective of the international universities is that's the best option you're giving us.
So, Kev, a lot of other things like demonstrated interest, non-factor?
Absolutely not. Demonstrated interest could not matter any less.
Yep.
It's
demonstrated interest doesn't matter. Activities don't matter. What about recommendations?
They can break you, but they very rarely make you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very similar to what I've heard from friends who do, and please, Mark, step in and correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
Who do interviews at selective, but maybe not super selective places in the U.S. is that we're looking to make sure that you can back up what you're saying and to make sure that there's not something egregiously wrong with you that you just would not.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. Interviews usually don't weed people that way. I'd say test scores are actually a good example of that. Like I tell people all the time, test scores in the U.S. for a selective school, they'll knock you out. They don't get you in.
Right. And
like, if you have non-competitive test scores, they'll knock you out. But having amazing test scores, you're a dime a dozen, so that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
That's maybe more how recs are, right? Like they can hurt you, but they don't tip you in typically.
They're very rarely going to tip you in. What will tip you in? And what becomes for the universities that you're offered one, which is a very small group, are interviews. Remember, Oxford and Cambridge and Imperial, they interview very differently than what you see in the U.S.
A whole other video we can do on the role of the interview in international admission. But thank you, my friend. Appreciate you as always.